The Genius Files, Mission Unstoppable, written by Dan Gutman. Welcome back to the Genius Files, Mission Unstoppable. We're ready for chapter number 5 that's titled Dr. Herman Warsaw and the Genius Files. And in this chapter, we're going to learn a little bit about how the Genius Files got started. Somebody certainly was trying to kill the McDonald's twins, and this somebody would prove to be amazingly persistent. We need to rewind the story here just a little bit, back to September 11th, 2001. A century from now, kids will learn about American history in school, and it will probably be divided into everything that happened before 9/11 and everything that happened after 9/11. It was on that tragic day that Dr. Herman Warsaw decided to take a cigarette break. This decision would change his life. In fact, this decision would ultimately change a lot of lives. Born in Poland, Dr. Warsaw was a brilliant man, and one whose brain examined the world differently from the rest of us. As an amateur inventor, he had made a small fortune creating a GPS that people could have implanted under the skin of their dog or their cat, so if their pet ran away, it could be tracked down easily. With the royalties that he earned from his invention, Dr. Warsaw didn't have to work for the rest of his life. But he offered his services as a consultant for $1 a year at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. America had been good to him, and he wanted to give something back. Dr. Warsaw was an odd-looking sort. He was young at the time, barely 30, but he had the look of an older man. He wore a baggy brown suit and a fedora as if he had just stepped out of a 1940s gangster movie. He was rail thin and slightly bent over. He had a squinty-eyed look of a man who had spent way too many hours of his short life staring at a computer screen instead of interacting with people in the real world. Smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day didn't help. Oh, Dr. Warsaw had tried to quit. Lots of times he tried. Hypnosis and acupuncture, and patches and gums, just about every over-the-counter cure-all that was on the market. But nothing worked. He had to have a cigarette in his hands at all times, even if he wasn't smoking it. But luckily for him, it was the pull of that addiction that made Dr. Warsaw step out of his Pentagon office at 9:38 a.m. on September 11th and take the elevator down from the 3rd floor and walk outside to the parking lot for a quick smoke break. He had just flicked his Bic when there was a horrible roar of jet engines that caused him to jerk his head upwards. That sound was way too close. Planes were not permitted to fly anywhere near the airspace above the Pentagon, the Capitol, the White House, or any of the top-level government buildings in Washington. But there it was, a plane diving out of the sky and heading towards him. 1 second later, American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington Dulles Airport, a Boeing 757, clipped a light pole at 350 miles per hour and slammed into the Pentagon, less than 50 yards where he was standing. He covered his eyes to shield them from the light and the heat. It was terrifying. The plane hit the building with such force that it was literally swallowed up by the Pentagon itself. It entered in so cleanly that for years afterwards, conspiracy theorists were claiming that no plane had struck the building. They said it had been an inside job, that the government must have purposely set off a bomb. But Dr. Warsaw knew what happened because he'd seen it with his own eyes. The nose of the plane tore right through his office, and if he had been sitting at his desk at that moment, he would have been dead instantly. A huge fireball erupted, and the Pentagon was in flames. 126 people in the building died that day, plus the 64 people on board the plane. Less than an hour earlier, 2 planes had hit the World Trade Center in New York City. If there was still any doubts that America was under attack, they were gone. And in a few short minutes, history would have to be rewritten. Dr. Warsaw sank to his knees involuntarily and looked at the cigarette in his hand. His life had been spared. It was at that moment that he made a firm commitment to devote the rest of his life to his country. As the sirens began to wail and the fire trucks pulled up outside the Pentagon, an idea flashed through Dr. Warsaw's brain. It was fleeting, one of those ideas that could have been lost in the moment if he had been distracted. But it was an idea that would change the world. Dr. Warsaw pulled out a little digital recorder that he kept in his pocket just for moments like this, when inspiration struck. As smoke and flames spewed out of the ruins of the Pentagon, he pushed record. And he started to make a few quick, clipped verbal notes. Nation under attack. Multiple problems. Nation divided. Unsolvable. No agreements. Society overwhelmed with perplexities. Can't see forest for trees. Older generation inflexible and stagnant. Kids are moldable. Figure out solutions. Start over. Geniuses. Standardized test scores. Find them. These ramblings would have sounded like gibberish to anyone who happened to be listening, but later Dr. Warsaw would sit down and synthesize his audio notes into a 434-page manifesto titled The Only Way Out, the simple solution to America's most pressing problems of the 21st century. No, you can't find it at Barnes & Noble's, and don't bother to look it up on Amazon.com. The Only Way Out was a top-secret document that was written for and distributed to a very small group of government officials. It would come to be known around Washington as the Genius Files. It would be impossible to reproduce Dr. Warsaw's entire document right here. It would also bore you to tears if you had to read it word for word. But here's a summary of the final page. In conclusion, civilization for the early 21st century is facing multiple serious problems. We've got internal terrorism, global climate change, economic meltdowns, dependence on unstable oil supplies, a failing education system, senseless wars, loose nukes, insane dictators, drugs, hunger, obesity, cancer, dwindling water and oil supplies, poverty, unemployment, racism, and overpopulation. Our nation is divided, making these problems seem insolvable. Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, young and old, north and south, rich and poor, they can't agree on anything. And that's not even taking into account the various races, ethnic groups, and religions, each with their own worldview and self-interest. Nothing ever seems to get done to solve these problems. Our society is overwhelmed by our complex situation. The problems are simply too complicated and entrenched for the current generation of leaders. They're paralyzed. It is time to start over with children. In Dr. Warsaw's view, the government, the grown-ups of the world, were just too set in their ways to change and solve the complex problems they created. The only way to solve the problem for the United States would be for the United States government to seek out the very smartest young people in the country and enlist them to be the problem solvers. Sometimes you can't fix things, he liked to say. You just have to replace them. In other words, Americans would have to start over from scratch with young geniuses. And these geniuses needed to be identified from the earliest age possible in order to cultivate and to use their skills over the long term. But how? It would be simple. Really, in fact, the mechanisms were already in place. The standardized tests that are routinely given out each year to every American child in public schools. All you needed to do was pick out the best and the brightest and recruit them to solve the nation's problems. As you might expect, This revolutionary idea was met with skepticism by the powers that be in Washington. Expecting kids to accomplish what the smartest adult minds in the world couldn't seemed outrageous to many people. Some adults were frankly threatened by the idea. It would take a few years and a change in presidents for Dr. Warsaw's plan to get approval and funding. It appeared as a tiny earmark in the economic stimulus package that was signed into law in the early 2009. And when the disgruntled senators were finished bickering over it, the funding was sliced in half. But finally, in the spring of 2009, every child in America had been tested and retested, and during the school year, a very select group of kids were chosen to be the very first group of YAGs, Young American Geniuses. Proud parents all over the country received letters in the mail informing them that their children were among the smartest children in America, and that these special kids were more than just simply gifted and talented. They were going to be enrolled in a special advanced placement class and enriched extracurricular activities the next school year. They would be put on the fast track to eventual college scholarships, and they would be touted as the leaders of tomorrow. What the parents were not told is that their children were being secretly recruited to carry out some of the government's most important and dangerous missions. Their kids would be like unmanned drones, assigned to solve the problems that couldn't be solved by grown-ups. These children were guinea pigs, and they came from all over the country, small towns and big cities, white kids and black kids. It was like the old Armour hot dog jingle. Big kids, little kids, kids who climbed on rocks, fat kids, skinny kids, even kids with chicken pox. Kids like Coke and Pepsi McDonald. That's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 is called Detention. Boy, I sure hope Coke and Pepsi aren't the ones in detention. Stay tuned. We'll find out for sure what happens to Coke and Pepsi.